Mr. President, I came to this building, this Capitol, about 12 hours ago today and recorded first thing this morning a video to share on social media with folks back at home who have been eagerly asking, what's up, what's happening, what's next? And my message was simple. After days of disagreement and of tussling, of fighting and of crafting, we have a deal and I am ready to vote. Let's move forward. 12 hours later, I stand in a largely empty chamber with an odd sense of foreboding, as I have all day, as have many of my colleagues, wondering what is taking so long? What is the delay? What are the remaining issues? And I am hopeful, prayerful even, that we will resolve what is left, move to this chamber, take up the text, vote it out, send it to the House, send it to the President, and send $2 trillion in support to our nation. But let me tell you, as I have waited today and yesterday, as I've taken phone calls from folks from Delaware, for whatever reason they all say, when will the Senate act? And we faced a challenge over our last couple of days between moving swiftly and moving wisely. To put together a package of this size with no hearings, with no committee proceedings, with no detailed legislative process means it is rough-hewn, means there are rough edges, means there will be mistakes in this bill. Is it perfect? No. In fact, in some pieces, we will discover as it unfolds far from it. But across the country, just as in this chamber, there is that sense of anxiousness, of anxiety, of when will it happen? Just a few weeks ago, the vast majority of our country was reading about coronavirus, about COVID-19 as something happening in distant countries on far shores. They read about sort of concerns about its alarming and rapid growth in Asia and then Europe. Things started changing as the stories got more dire and more gray, as public health officials began to predict a global pandemic, as the World Health Organization announced it a global pandemic, as scientific leaders began to say that the United States would inevitably be touched by it, as our colleagues from the Pacific Northwest told us about how their communities were being affected, as extended contacts and friends and acquaintances on social media and then on the press shared how they or members of their community had become infected. And as it began to move across our country, it began to impact a remarkable range of institutions from baseball to Broadway, the closures of all sorts of treasured American institutions, every major sports league, every major public gathering. And as now state after state has issued edicts, as city and county alike all over our country have asked people to close their restaurants and their bars, their small businesses, as hotels have no occupants, as airplanes fly with no passengers, it's become haunting, eerie, the sense of an imminent disaster. Just before coming over here, I read an article in the New York Times about how in my region, in the Mid-Atlantic, it has hit. In the borough of Queens, in the city of New York, in a public hospital known as Elmhurst, yesterday, 13 patients died. And in a riveting account, the nurses and the doctors describe a catastrophic situation. Public health officials, trained health aides stretched to their limits, tested as they hadn't been before, struggling to get personal protective equipment, to have enough ventilators, to have enough ICU units. And I'll tell you, as over the last couple of days, I've talked with the heads of each of our major hospitals, folks who run skilled nursing facilities, nonprofits, community health centers. As I've heard from nurses and doctors I know, the level of alarm and concern has steadily risen in recent days. So folks, tonight as I stand here on the floor of the Senate, I am mindful that our nation is suffering, that there are people all over the world, but particularly here in the United States, in the states that we represent, who are anxious, who are unemployed, who are uncertain, in some cases, now too many, who are infected, who are hospitalized. It has come home to this chamber as one of our colleagues has tested positive, and one of our dear colleagues' husband's spouse is hospitalized. We know members of the House and the Senate, of our staff and our immediate community have been touched by this dread disease. And we are now at a critical moment in our modern history, simultaneously a public health crisis and an economic crisis. I've heard too many people say it's unprecedented. It's not unprecedented. The United States and our nation have made it through tougher times than this. To say that the Great Depression and the Second World War, the Civil War and the Revolution, the hard work of labor organizing and the desperate work of throwing off the shackles of segregation and of Jim Crow, to say that those weren't tough and difficult struggles misses the significance of our history and the things we've overcome. But for most of us, for most of our families, for most of our communities, this wave, this pandemic, this virus, and the combined health and economic disaster that is upon us may be the greatest test we have faced. So how have we answered? Thousands of businesses already closed, millions of people already unemployed, and a nation fearful of a pandemic swamping the resources of our hospitals and our health systems. Let me just speak briefly in broad strokes to what is in this bill, which we have finally ultimately hammered out after days of disagreement, and in advance of our getting the final official text. In the broadest strokes, the help that will be delivered to the American people by this bill starts with individual assistance, something the President has championed and the Democrats have supported. We've had different versions of it, but we've roughly agreed on $1,200 to every adult citizen making below $75,000, and it phases out to those making below $100,000. With $500 per child, your average family might well see $3,000 to $4,000. These checks will come out in weeks, delivered directly for those with direct deposit through the IRS or by check to those harder to find who haven't filed recently but are eligible. This is a remarkable direct support to help millions of Americans have cash in their family checkbook to get through the unexpected hardship of these next few months. There's more than $100 billion in this bill to support our health workers on the front line and the hospitals that make our public health possible. You heard that story about Elmhurst Hospital. In my own home state, there's hospitals, rural and urban, large and small, that without this support will struggle to make it through this period. The heroes of this period are the folks who are working, the folks who are cleaning offices, trains, hospital rooms, often without enough protective equipment, often without health care themselves, often without adequate pay. The folks who labor at night here in this Capitol in our offices to make sure they're clean and safe from this virus we can't see. The folks who work in public hospitals work long hours. They're orderlies, they're nurses, they're the paramedics and the ambulance drivers who deliver the sick, and they're the surgeons and the doctors who direct their care. And one of the things I am proudest of that is in this now that was not in this several days ago is $150 billion to states and counties and cities. In the 10 years I spent in county government, I came to deeply respect the men and women who help keep our county government afloat and our community stronger, safer, and healthier. This support, this direct support to the states and the counties on the front lines of this epidemic will help them get through it. There's a $500 billion fund, the subject of much discussion and debate, that as initially written and proposed would help sustain some of our iconic industries like the airlines, but with almost no transparency in terms of the loans or the grants that would be given, and almost no restrictions on how the companies to receive them might use them for what purposes. Broadly speaking, after days of fighting, we've come to agreements that I support and embrace. Restrictions on buybacks and dividends and executive compensation, guarantees against layoffs and against the destruction of collective bargaining agreements, and broadly speaking, transparency and accountability. One of the things I am most proud of is that there will be now an accountability board, a pandemic response accountability committee, both an inspector general, a special inspector general, and $80 million in this bill for the operation of that accountability committee. Let me move, since I see I have a number of colleagues who've joined me on the floor, to just a few other points if I could. There's $350 billion in this bill for the Small Business Administration to disperse to small businesses and to nonprofits all over our country, with an incentive structure to change it from a loan to a grant to those who would retain or rehire their workforce. As I've heard from restaurant owners, from hotel owners, from those who work in bars and restaurants and hotels in my community, those are the folks who've been hit the first and the hardest by the closures. This provision will allow those small businesses to reopen quickly and robustly when we get on the other side of this pandemic. And I look forward to working with my colleagues, with the SBA administrator, with the SBA lenders in my state and around the country to make sure it's done well and that it's done quickly. I wrote the bill that added $17 billion more so that 320,000 current small businesses who are current SBA loan holders get 6 months of relief, moves them off the agenda of the SBA staff and the SBA lenders to clear the decks for them to administer this $350 billion. And I supported Senator Cardin in his initiative to add $10 billion for small, rapid grants to the most severely impacted businesses and nonprofits. This section of the overall bill, where Senators Rubio and Collins, Cardin and Shaheen negotiated most of it, struck me as the most bipartisan and most productive. There is so much more in this bill I could speak to. The ways in which the resources of the Federal Reserve are going to be deployed to help medium businesses and small businesses. The ways in which the private sector in my home state has stepped up to partner and to deliver critically needed resources, whether it's refurbishing ventilators or donating surplus PPE from the construction sector that they don't need today, or it's the university that's closed its research labs but makes its resources available to our hospital. There are some remarkable efforts at partnership going on in my community and around the country. But at the end of the day, we have a critical question. Is this bill perfect? No. Could we improve it by more time here arguing with each other, offering more amendments, debating further? Yes. Is there something I badly wanted that did not get in this final bill? Absolutely. We've had 9 major states delay their elections, delay their presidential primaries because of this pandemic. And I urged that a bill written by my colleagues, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Wyden, that I joined, be added in text to require every state to have a plan to vote by mail during this pandemic. If our troops could vote from the front lines in the Civil War and Second World War, by gosh, we should have a plan to vote even if this pandemic continues. I was disappointed. That text is ultimately not going to be in this bill. $400 million will begin to help those states that want to vote by mail to expand and strengthen vote by mail. And I will be back. I will be back to insist on this provision in the next bill. But as I have said to many colleagues in the last few days, we cannot all get everything we hope for and want and believe to be important in this bill. We must put down the tools of partisanship and personal interest and sectional concerns. We must put down some of the things we most hope for. We must put down the tools with which we so often fight each other. And we must come together and take up the implements of national purpose, of compromise, of consensus, and deliver these resources to a nation anxious, concerned, and at times even angry at all of us in the Senate for what they see as too long a delay. So with that, let me just say to my colleagues, it is time for us to take up this bill, rough-hewn as it is, pass it through this chamber, send it to the House, I've urged my colleagues in the House to pass it promptly, send it to the President's desk for signature, and then let us all get to the hard work of making sure we do the best we can for the people we represent with this historic stimulus package, this remarkable coronavirus relief package that is going to deliver $2 trillion of assistance and support to communities all over our country. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.